Presentation today deals with a particular moment in the history of immersive media, situated specifically between the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s. As you are aware, this time frame corresponds with the end point of the box office success of Cinerama in the United States, and also coincides with an especially tense moment during the Cold War. My discussion will center on how these two contexts, one of industrial character and the other of a political and ideological nature, had an impact on the changing film exhibition environment outside the US. I will bring into view how the exportability of immersive technologies extended their profitability when adapted to foreign markets. Specifically, I will be focusing on the arrival of Cinerama in the city of Havana, Cuba in 1958. I will explain the singular circumstances that saw the same film projection technologies installed by Warner Brothers in one of Havana's main movie theaters become repurposed 3 years later in 1962 to project a very different visual imaginary, that of the Soviet Union, produced through their own panoramic innovation, Kinopanorama. I will start by briefly discussing the context of Cinerama's emergence, to then talk about how Hollywood transferred its large screen immersive innovations to foreign markets, such as Cuba's. After that, I will explain the circumstances under which Soviet Kinopanorama films substituted their American counterparts on Cuban screens. In the early 50s, Hollywood experienced a significant decline in movie audiences, due in part to the increasing appeal of television as home entertainment. In response to what was widely considered as a film industry crisis, the studios invested in technical innovations and new formats like Cinerama and CinemaScope to offer more color, better sound, and wider screens. Cinerama was a three-projector system that created three-paneled, deeply curved screens accompanied by multi-channel stereophonic sound. The original Cinerama production, This is Cinerama, was first presented to the public in September 1952 in New York City. The second, Cinerama Holiday, was released 3 years later in 1955. These were travel documentaries featuring the grandiosity of landscapes, as well as the image and sound quality of staged musical and dance performances. The spectator could also experience the exhilaration of movement from a first-person subjective camera perspective, be it riding down on a roller coaster or flying over the Grand Canyon or the Swiss Alps. Like most travelogues, these films presented the viewer with exotic and hard-to-reach locations, with the added bonus of an extra widescreen and full-color access to such majestic views. At the same time, these films were conceived as self-congratulatory odes to their own technical achievement. In each case, the Cinerama movie was preceded by a short preface, shot in black and white in the standard frame size, featuring an expert explaining the innovative technical aspects of the Cinerama production process. This would be followed by a ceremonial curtain opening to reveal the wider, crisper, and more colorful version of the medium. Unlike many of the immersive technologies that are being discussed throughout the conference, Cinerama did not involve spectator mobility nor the interaction of a user with the created space. But if we allow for a more flexible understanding of how illusion affects the viewer, even the seated viewer, then it is clear that Cinerama achieved a sense of hyperrealism, which, as Alison Griffiths puts it, constructs a distant space of heightened geographic or cultural interest. During the first 2 years after introduction, American audiences responded very positively to Cinerama's promise of a unique experience. The film played in a single New York theater at very high admission prices, and proved to be very profitable. In order to replicate this roadshow model of exhibition abroad, specific foreign market movie theaters needed to be remodeled. Havana was the first Latin American city to offer this option. In February 1957, it was announced that the Warner Theater in Oklahoma City would revert to a regular theater and that the Cinerama equipment would be transferred to Havana. This is not surprising given that the Cuban film market was one of the most profitable ones in the continent. Radio Centro, one of the most centrally located movie theaters, was retrofitted to accommodate the Cinerama format. On February 24, 1958, it opened with the film This is Cinerama. 6 months later, a one-page ad in the magazine Bohemia announced the release of the second Cinerama feature, Cinerama Holiday. The ad promised an experience like no other, one that would convey all the emotion of travel to the viewer. While the critical reception of the films was lukewarm, the screenings were well attended, and This is Cinerama continued to be shown until early 1961. By that time, more than 200,000 Cubans had seen it. In 1958, when Cinerama was first exhibited in Havana, the sociopolitical situation in Cuba added to the sense of crisis in the film exhibition business. While box office profits had increased steadily from 1940 to 1955, between 1956 and 1959, Cuban movie screens became significantly less profitable. Local commentators attributed this situation to reasons such as the lower quality of films, the increasing appeal of casino games as a form of entertainment, and the generalized political instability in the country. In effect, growing discontent with the dictatorial government of Fulgencio Batista and its repression of political dissent had led to social unrest and guerrilla tactics in urban and rural areas across the country. The situation escalated to the point that the guerrilla army led by Fidel Castro overthrew the Batista government on January 1st, 1959. Subsequently, the new leadership undertook a large number of economic and social measures, which were initially perceived as a necessary leap forward towards democracy and prosperity in the island. However, between 1959 and 1961, the implementation of nationalist policies in all economic, social, and political realms provided the state with larger prescriptive powers than early supporters of the revolution had anticipated. The nationalization of the major industries controlled by foreign interests was followed by the expropriation of large, medium, and small businesses, respectively. Cuba replaced its strong trade links with the United States with an increasingly close commercial relationship with the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc. As part of these radical reforms, the government transferred all US film distribution and exhibition businesses to ICAIC, a newly created state-funded film institute. One of ICAIC's first priorities was to replace American movies with other types of filmic productions, and during the early 60s, Soviet cinema filled the great majority of Cuban screens. For example, while in the late 50s, Hollywood movies occupied about 50% of Cuban screens, this number dropped to 1% in the early 60s. In direct parallel, Soviet and Eastern European films had a 1% presence in the 50s, which increased to 73% in the early 60s, with an all-time high of 92% in 1963. That is 201 new releases in 1 year. This process of replacement was happening at all levels, from specialized cinematheque screenings of Soviet film classics to commercial film exhibition at regular neighborhood movie theaters, to Soviet filmmakers visiting and filming in the country, to plans for Soviet-Cuban co-productions. Taking into account this overwhelming presence, it is not surprising that Soviet-made panoramic films were to replace American ones. From a technical standpoint, Kinopanorama was very similar to the Cinerama format. As James Krukonis' research demonstrates, Kinopanorama was envisioned as a competitor of Cinerama. Soviet critics praised its superiority based on their success at eliminating the joint lines between the three panels through an ingenious use of mirrors. The Kinopanorama system was also able to house all three projectors in a single booth at the rear of the theater instead of being spread out across the back of the auditorium. Furthermore, the Soviet format consisted of 9 magnetic tracks of stereophony, 2 more than Cinerama. Both systems had a part to play in the cultural Cold War in terms of demonstrating the technological ingenuity of the American and the Soviet superpowers, and as efficient vehicles for displaying each country's landmarks and achievements. While the Cinerama travelogues were produced between 1952 and 1958, Kinopanorama films arrived to Soviet screens in 1958 and were subsequently showcased at the Brussels World Fair, released in Oslo and Paris, and briefly screened at a New York theater as part of the Soviet exhibition of science, technology, and culture in the summer of 1959. The title of Vast is My Native Land, also known as Great is My Country in English, was translated into French and Spanish as 2 Hours in the USSR. Another film, known in English as The Enchanted Mirror, was marketed in Cuba as On the Way to the Ballet. Together, these movies took the viewers to a part of the world that had been completely absent from Cinerama's worldwide tours. These Kinopanorama films gave spectators a tour of the USSR, taking them from the Caucasus Mountains to Moscow, Leningrad, Siberia, and the Black Sea, always emphasizing the industrial and cultural achievements of the Soviet Union. Although I have not found a commercial copy of this film, I hope that this short, very pixelated 45-second clip of Great is My Country can give you an idea of the journey across modern-day Soviet Union the movie was meant to offer. We can recognize the symbolic significance of replacing This is Cinerama with a film promoted as 2 Hours in the USSR in the year 1961. For the Cuban public, Cinerama movies represented an extension of American worldviews that were already very familiar. On the other hand, Soviet Kinopanorama films presented an intriguing new set of geographic and ideological references. This display of Soviet modernity was part of a process of substitution of values and allegiances that started as an invitation, but that would take more dogmatic and consequential forms in the years to come. I have brought to light the brief coexistence of immersive cinematic texts like Cinerama and Kinopanorama films at the height of the Cold War as a reminder of how competing ideological discourses appropriate new technologies and media products. However, I do not offer this case study as a straightforward instance of cultural imperialism, because that would imply that Cuban movie audiences of the late 1950s and early 1960s constituted a homogeneous and undifferentiated public, which, as I have demonstrated elsewhere, was certainly not the case. Rather, my goal with this presentation has been to share some preliminary thoughts on the repurposing of technological infrastructure and to incorporate a fuller picture of the transnational history of immersive media. Thank you very much.